Then we come to the last one I'll talk about, which is fourth order design, which is how can you apply all those sorts of skills that are well developed. Some of those fields are 100-200 years old of academic theory. How could you apply that to the design of the sorts of systems that you're involved with every day? So the design of a tax system, the design of a social welfare system, the design of a physical environmental sort of system. How could you apply some of the findings from those different fields of design to the design of these complex systems? So this complex systems is really foundational to what we're talking about here in terms of, it's a bit like the material science. You need to understand about steel and not quite wood on top of that table to build that table. You probably need to know that if you sliced through it, you'd find some chipboard. Understanding the system is a bit like material science, I think, for second order design. Understanding the system is the material science of fourth order design. So there's another element to this point, though, that I'd like to make around understanding complex systems. So the challenge is, how can you have this abstract, nebulous sort of concept of, there's a system out there, to zooming right in and getting right down deep and getting to the empathy of people. Those of you familiar, some of you will, I'd say half the room are probably familiar with the sort of Mandelbrot fractal series. You'll know that you can just infinitely keep drilling into that series, and you can keep drilling into each piece, and you will come up each time with an equal level of complexity and some self-similarity at every level. And that is just so true of the systems you work in. So this notion of fractals, I think, is one way of helping us to understand this notion of zoom, that we need to zoom in. So this could be the whole of New Zealand. This could be the whole of Wellington. If we kept going, that could be a suburb, a street, and here we are in somebody's house talking to them about their situation. There is a feel you get when you're in somebody's home or in their work context or whatever context it is you need to go to, that you just can never get from trying to imagine it in a nice room like this. So if you're sitting in someone's lounge room, they've got 3 kids, the television's on, you're trying to ask this person some serious questions and the kids just do what kids do. It just puts a completely different complexion on what we might imagine you can do, which is sit down at a nice uncluttered desk and do your online work, and you've got an hour to do it and you won't be interrupted, and no one's going to spill water over the computer, and it's very hard when we're in our nice office to, even though we live in those situations. I can see some knowing nods of people who've clearly got children that do these things. It's hard to project yourself into that in a when you're in a work sense. So getting out and really, it's no longer enough to try and stand in the shoes of the user. You've actually got to be with the community, be with the citizen, be with the group you're designing for. So here you see a group of customers. I showed you a picture right at the front, and if Jim goes to the next picture, I think that will be there. And if Jim hits the button again, we're going to see this is not an amorphous crowd. These are real people. We're now discovering something about these people. So at first, what seemed like a faceless crowd, when you zoom in and get inside it, here we have a student, part-time worker. Here we have someone recently unemployed, thinking about maybe going to do some further study. We've got a retired person who's a primary carer for a sick husband. Jenny's flat out busy mother of 2. George, recently separated, adjusting to single parenting. So this is the sort of thing that I think when you get out into the community and start speaking to people, you can see you're actually designing services for these people, not for some blob, not for some sort of system, it's for some real people. So there's been a strong recognition, I think, with this service delivery reform in Australia. They asked us to do a co-design strategy, co-design blueprint, and we've really worked with them to build that sort of capability.
One of the things in 2003 when we introduced user-based design, we called it back then, into IRD, getting the team to go out and talk to stakeholders and taxpayers was actually a really scary thing for the team. I remember it was, I think, late 2004, the first time we did this, and the team were actually really afraid to go out and talk. And because they thought, they get all these tax issues and this fear and compliance and all of that. And what they found was the small to medium businesses in this case were so happy that someone was coming along to listen, not to talk. And that was quite a breakthrough. So they came back, I remember it, and I remember different people who were involved in that, came back absolutely buzzing with some really good insights. They're new to it, but it was interesting because it can be fearful even for, your own people to go out and kind of push through that. But when people want to be heard like they need to breathe, and that was a really powerful switch for some of the team in the early days.
It seems to me that trust is actually quite an important part of helping people to feel safe in trying a new approach. What's your experience of co-creating services with customers in a situation where you've not had time to develop those trust relationships with them, and how do you go about doing that?
Well, nearly all our co-design work is with people we've got no relationship with. People, when they participate in research, have usually been used to people coming in with a clipboard and some pre-cast questions and ticking and flicking and then sort of shooting out the door. We are much more interested in sitting down with people and really hearing their story, really zooming in, really empathising with them and understanding what drives them. And I think people really appreciate that you're genuinely interested, you're genuinely engaging with them because you actually want to know. The other thing that has been incredibly powerful is we often go to people more than once. So with that online example actually that I just showed you, the photos, we went to people and listened, and then we went back to those people a few weeks later and said, this is what we heard, and now can we sort of co-design with you what might help meet those needs that we heard. Now that really built trust with people, and I think would have had a ripple effect on the reputation of the department that we were working for, because they would say positive things to their network of people.
Last year we got asked to present at the Australian ANZOG, but in that we had spoken to some homeless people in Melbourne and the homeless shelter, and we asked David, who was a client, to speak on our behalf, and the kind of experiences that he got, he actually figured out that some homeless people were actually quite technically advanced, that they're incredibly organised because they have to be, because they have to survive. And it kind of, again, it opens his eyes as the client, as a person who is designing this service, and it also opened the eyes of, the whole audience in the room, because it actually changed their view.
It struck me recently, somebody told me that some families receive 40 different services. Not necessarily all helpful, because there's 40 of them, they've got to somehow integrate them. But if you had 40 services and you interacted with one each week for an hour, it's a full-time job. You definitely need an iPhone to organise your life. More questions? Yeah.
The thing about whole systems is that they're messy, And they're kind of difficult and they don't actually
Yes.
end. It's all very nice to talk about nested systems and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
How do you determine in your projects the parameters for the system that you're actually going to, look at or work in?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, because I think that's exactly what it's like. And I think sometimes it's not framed so much around the system as around the person.
Right.
So for example, I just mentioned the work we're doing with vulnerable families. We're not actually bounding that anywhere, because they're interacting with the health system, the housing system, the justice system, the community sector, the community support system, the government support system, the health system, just to name a few. So rather than say we're looking at those systems, we're saying we're looking at vulnerable families. And so we're almost defining the system by the experience of the people. In reality, you've got to use a bit of judgment as to where you're going to bound that off. So the tax system, you would want to take in the banking system, the investment system, the rental property system, some of those things. But you don't want to know probably about their next holiday or their shopping experience. You might, but you may not. So it does require some conscious thought, and it's quite important to have that thinking.